If you could put a dollar amount to the cost of this fragmentation, I think most people are going to line up and look for a change.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Housing Insiders, the podcast for founders, builders, lenders, and regulators, and anyone who believes that everyone should be well housed. I'm Jonathan Lawless.
And I'm Jeremy Potter. On Housing Insiders, we're hosting the conversations you won't hear anywhere else about how to make housing more innovative and attainable.
We're super proud to partner with Built Rewards, who's bringing you these smart conversations. If you have an idea for a guest or a show, or especially have an interest in sponsoring an episode, please email us at podcast@thehousinginsiders.com.
And if you like the show, we're told one of the best things you can do is leave a review. If you leave a review, that spreads the word, and we can get the podcast out there. We can make more of these episodes for you.
All right. Today's episode is one that I've been very excited about for a very long time. We have a guest joining us today, actually joining us from Europe, where it's not quite as early as it is here on the East Coast. Ivan Rupnik, he's an architect, scholar, associate professor of architecture at Northeastern University. He's also the founding partner of MOD X, which is a really cool firm focused on advancing industrialized construction methods in the building industry. Look, his expertise centers on offsite and modular construction, which is amazing. Has a great emphasis and focus and background on regulatory frameworks, such as national building codes, which we will talk a ton about, and, just how to impact housing innovation and scalability. So again, really have been looking forward to having you on. Ivan, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
Ivan, it's probably appropriate that you're joining us from abroad, from Europe. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing there and how that work relates to what we're going to talk about today?
Well, sure. So I spend about 7 months a year in the US and then about 5 months a year in Europe and abroad. So looking at best practices, both in the technology, but also in the policy and finance side, and bringing it back to the good old US of A, but really also finding value in comparing and contrasting how different approaches play out in different contexts.
Ivan, we've got so much to cover, and at the National Housing Supply Summit, where I last saw you, you did an amazing job of laying out just the background on building codes. So I was hoping we could start there. Maybe just give us a quick overview of what are building codes, how are they implemented, what is the process for changing it? I know you've talked a lot about the IRC, I think is the acronym, and just how things like HVAC systems get determined. But anyway, can you just give us an overview of building codes?
Well, so building codes are obviously the regulations for how our structures are designed and constructed and even sometimes occupied. We've had building codes in this country for about 100 years, starting with codes that really dealt with fire and fire safety. Life safety is really the top priority of building codes in the US particularly. And then we have 3 different building codes that touch on housing. We have the 2 codes, which are called the I codes, the IRC, or International Residential Code, which focuses mostly on single family and some missing middle, and then the IBC, which really focuses on multifamily. And then we also have something called the HUD code, which is a federal national preemptive code. The other 2 are model prescriptive codes that are adopted and adapted by states, whereas the HUD code is a national code. And that HUD code actually regulates the manufactured housing industry, which constitutes currently about 10% of housing, but has constituted as much as a quarter of housing at certain periods in our recent history.
These organizations, IRC, are they actual groups of people?
So there are 2 groups, right? So there's the ICC, their National Code Council. They work to develop model codes. So they work with industry through a consensus process. And then they offer those model codes up to the states for adoption. And then even sometimes smaller units, so even counties can adapt aspects of it. And they have essentially a 3-year cycle of updates. And then there's, again, HUD, the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, maintains the so-called HUD code. That's mandated across the states, although there's a consensus project process too. And each state has what's called a HUD, a program that administers it. So we have these model codes, which are adopted and adapted, and then further adapted by local jurisdictions. So for example, in Colorado, we estimate there's about 300 variants just in that state alone of the I codes, whereas the manufacturer, their HUD code is actually consistent across all 50 states, but does allow for variations based really on climate and geography and even the seismic and some conditions.
I know at some point we're going to get into a little bit of the history because you've done the research and you've looked back, but just from a practical perspective first, in real estate, they say location, location, location. Is that the reason we have such a location based obsession with code? I mean, 300 codes in just one state with these little nuances and variances. Is it just tied back to that? Is it that simple that that's where it came from and that's why we have this? Because it seems really problematic to a modern approach. Is that how you see it, or what am I missing?
That's right. No, you're totally right. And there's nothing, I mean, it's logical that the building code reflects the building industry. The building industry was historically localized. And then we sort of started regulating it more, particularly through densification of cities, and particularly because of fire and industrial buildings tending to be kind of a life safety issue. And so we sort of developed a system about 100 years ago, which really just reflected business as usual in a region. And then we sort of scaled up. And not only is it regional in terms of scope, it's also regional in terms of approach, of techniques of construction. And so that's been the process. And that's been the process globally. So most countries have a similar history to building code. But in the 1960s, even earlier, but around 1960s, that began to change as construction and building products began to industrialize and regulations became more complex. And so most countries identified that this was a major innovation and cost burden, having so many different regulations and also having so much space for even additional interpretation. So in Colorado, there might be 300 codes, but in reality, there's as many codes as there are inspectors, because we can actually, we allow inspectors to interpret code to a point where you could argue that every inspector is their own code to some degree. And that's not unique to the US historically. It's just unique to the US in that we are the most old-fashioned, to respectfully speaking. Every country went through that process. Every country did the calculations, and every country said, "Boy, that is expensive, and let's do something else."
It's so interesting. I've heard, and tell me if I'm right or wrong. Like it's pretty amazing to me that all these local inspectors can have so much of an opinion that it'll be reflected in an actual local code. I've heard that sometimes code. I mean, the knock on zoning has been that zoning is often used to zone out to prevent certain types of building happening in areas. Do building codes kind of get used for the same purpose? Do you see like, hey, we're going to make really onerous building codes in this area, which means it's going to be impossible for anybody to build, or it'll be really expensive if anyone wants to build something new in this area?
It's such a touchy subject. So I'm just, as a researcher, I can say I have plenty of citations from other people, including, from the 1960s and 1990s today, that verify what you just said, which is that it is used as a gatekeeping device. Now, those variations are not included in the local codes, which makes it even more confusing. It's because of the way we construct our codes, and because they're prescriptive, because they prescribe very specific techniques, that weirdly they create opportunities for interpretation. It's like increased bureaucracy. It requires more work to be completed. So by creating a more onerous building code, you actually have more space for interpretation, like in any legal structure, right? So it's not that you don't even know. If you knew that there were 3,000 building codes, that would even maybe be easier, but we don't know how they will be interpreted, which makes it even more onerous. So there's fragmentation, but there's interpretation too. People talk about AI solving this. Well, it's very hard for AI to solve things that aren't in text and their interpretations, for example.
I can't wait to jump into that. But one of the things that you just mentioned was the prescriptive nature of our codes here. Can you talk to us a little bit about the alternative? What is, like, internationally, you've done a lot of work in Sweden. Reading up on that, it seems like that's the performance code. Can you talk to us about why that distinction is important, prescriptive versus performance?
Yeah, so there are two big trajectories of regulatory reform in the world, and the US is approached in the same way. One is harmonizing code over as large of an area as possible, even if those are prescriptive requirements. So it allows for companies to scale and allows for more predictability. The other one is a shift from prescribing specific solutions to construction to moving to performance criteria for those solutions. So saying not specifically how you'll do something, but how it has to perform. So that performance-based approach was actually lobbied for and advocated 100 years ago by people like Frederick Taylor, who's a modern management guru. And he was actually arguing not that factories only should move in this direction, but that the entire economy should move in this direction. People didn't listen so much here, but very quickly, for example, the Germans in World War I, who were fighting the US, said, we're only going to stay in this game if we streamline our economy. We're going to take these ideas from the US and we're going to make our industry really efficient so that we can stay in the war for 2 more years. And so ironically, Germany developed this approach to standardization and regulations based on very radical American ideas from industry and apply them to a sector. So nice little brands like you might have heard of, like Mercedes or BMW, the cost innovation of those products come from a regulatory environment that's been around for 100 years that is also applied to building products and buildings in other contexts. But we've tried, but we have not fully adapted our own ideas at scale in this country.
I guess reading a little bit about the history and would love to hear your take on it. So Operation Breakthrough, I believe it was called, which was HUD Secretary George Romney's kind of major, costly investment of doing the hard work of what would it take to sort of create a better building code. And then your point is other countries have adopted that to great success. And here we are. What you're talking about, this sort of interpretive basis of building codes, adding to a level of complexity from local building codes, to me just makes it impossible to think about industrialized construction at scale. I mean, now you've got to build 20,000 products to be able to serve, housing in the country. And so anyway, any reflection on what we did historically and why are we here today? I mean, this is just, your description is insanity. I mean, why are we here today?
Well, your response is what everyone in the last 50 years has had to this situation. And we don't just forget about the problem, we forget about the shock of responding. So George Romney came from automotive, and then he was shocked with building construction because automotive is regulated like building construction is in Sweden today. I mean, Volvo was very much also involved in that process, just like Toyota was in Japan. So Romney came in he wasn't even ready to do a national building code. That was too controversial. He was trying to assess objectively how much it costs to not have a national building code. That's what he was funded for. And to provide short-term solutions that would allow, at least for innovative companies, to be able to circumnavigate the quagmire. Now, unfortunately, because the project, he was very successful. The funding he got was very successful at proving out that it was very costly. Congress wanted to prove it, and it was proven. And Congress said, yes, we believe you, that fragmented and prescriptive code was costly. But he also proved out that it was particularly detrimental, not just for upfront costs, but for innovation. And when I say innovation, I don't mean like flying buildings or anything like that. I just mean innovation to get affordable and higher quality housing. So Romney was able to prove those through that project. And nevertheless, we could talk about it more, that data exists. Congress has it. Congress actually said, yes, building codes are a problem and we need to do something about it in 1974 after serious work was done, not just in a lab, but in 9 real sites in different parts of the US. So we knew it was a problem. We could calculate the cost. And we also proved out that innovation really, it's not just about getting lower cost housing or more units, but that to innovate like other industries, you need a level playing field. You need performance requirements that allow for people to innovate different solutions to what you need, as opposed to trying to figure out what they're going to do and then tell them how to do it, which doesn't sound very American to me, by the way. But anyway, that's a whole different story. He was able to do that, and he was able to convince Congress this was an issue. And then a bunch of complicated things happened in the 70s, and we sort of forgot about these things.
We forgot about it.
We moved on to other things in our mind, John. There was It's like literally what we're talking about. I think the thing that I've been really trying to form a question around, Ivan, is often calling something a crisis and drawing a bunch of attention to it draws in resources and draws in movement around these things. So more recently, we've seen more political and regulatory attention, mayors, for instance, but also at the national level, calling it a housing crisis, saying we are short enough units now, and there's enough consensus around how many that is, that we now have a crisis. Is that the way you see it from a supply side? And then also, have you seen that making any changes around some of these areas that you just mentioned?
Boy, you guys are smart. Good softballs. Thanks for another favorite topic. So I think what we've seen over the last 50 years is you have a crisis. First response is what we call demand aggregation from government or whether it's local. So it's let's throw money or work at fledgling industrialized building companies. And that can work for a while and they get used to having a supply, aggregated demand. What seems to happen is we spend a good bit of money on creating that demand, but then we don't fix the structural problems in the system, particularly these regulatory barriers. And as soon as you remove that funding, those companies can't survive. And so what we saw with Operation Breakthrough, that Congress had already mandated 26 million units of housing over 10 years. So that's that first crisis response. The intelligence came and saying, wait a second, we're going to shove all that money through a tiny hole of thousands of regulatory systems. We're not going to get very much of that housing built. Not only we do not have enough land, labor, and lumber, we also are going to be quagmired in this process. And so Romney spent a little bit of that money to assess how to reframe the spending of that capital to actually get to those goals. That's exactly what also happened in all these other countries that we've studied, which is that if you just pump money into the system, you're not going to get the units you want. But we get it. It's much more, it seems less politically complicated to pump money and promise units than it is to say, let's have a little bit more of a difficult conversation about how to fix the framework in the first place. It costs less actual dollars, but it may cost more political capital. I get that. And as a researcher, that is international. Even in the Soviet Union, they had the same issues, believe it or not. There was the same, let's just pump money into it. And then we'll get, a tenth of the units we planned, or let's do the painful work of trying to fix the system with less money, but a little bit more political goals that can be bipartisan, certainly can be bipartisan. And that's been the game. And that's Operation Breakthrough was not about building units. It was about demonstrating scientifically that it's a cost.
I mean, what you're saying makes so much sense. And we'll take a break here in a second, but I want to ask you one last question. And then when we're back from the break, let's just really figure out how we fix this because it's just crazy. But my last question for you is we figured this out and then we forgot it. But it strikes me that there might be people that are opposed to this, maybe that say that it is in my best interest to have this complexity. Is it really just inertia and just that it would take a lot of work to fix? Or is there an interest that's opposing making building codes more nationalized?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think there's certainly people that take advantage of the system as it is, but I think the other question is just like Romney is if you could put a dollar amount to the cost of this fragmentation, I think most people are going to line up and look for a change. And it was wholeheartedly accepted by Congress. He did the work and they got the data and they said yes. And then for reasons that aren't clear, it didn't go forward. But in every other country, the same conversation was first resistance because business as usual is always business is comfortable. And then you put the cost figures where 30 to 50% of the cost goes into permitting inspection and even some of the design engineering that goes into doing this over and over again. And once you get those numbers out there, people just sort of get out of the way. And we need those numbers. We need updated versions. They're going to probably look the same as the historic ones, unfortunately, but we still need to do it just so people feel like they're up to date. And then I don't see really, you can't save this kind of money with new materials. You can't save it with robots or AI. You can only really save it by doing the hard work of structurally reforming the way we code, permit, and inspect our housing.
Absolutely love it. Let's take a break to hear from another innovative company and a word from our sponsor. Built Rewards is a payment platform for housing that rewards members in their home and neighborhood. Built is the payment platform for over 5 million units because Built provides incredible value to residents and to property owners and managers that use it. Properties using Built have seen reduced turnover, increased usage of electronic payments, and fewer missed payments. And with our latest resident loyalty program, Built is changing the way that property managers can reward good behavior. Managers can assign rewards and benefits to tenants for a variety of activities like early lease renewal. If you're interested in learning more, go to alliance.builtrewards.com.
Welcome back to Housing Insiders. We're talking to Ivan Rupnik of MOD X. Ivan, we just heard about this dynamic between proactive versus reactive. I thought in my head, it reminded me a little bit of preventative healthcare versus urgent healthcare. Preventative costs less, but we're bad at it. And so this is just another example of reactive policy and reactive politics instead of proactive. And so John said the key thing, how do we change that? How do we really affect change in this area. And so I know we were all together at the National Housing Supply Conference, and you made some key recommendations. Maybe you could talk to us about what those are and what happens next to get moving in that direction.
I like to think this is all innovative, but I'm much happier to say that everything I'm going to tell you is a good old-fashioned common sense, and it's worked in this country and it's worked in every other country. So it's really, you can look at it in three steps. You can look at it first, finding a means for innovative companies to take their R&D, to take their investment, and to get essentially a safe route around code compliance. That's called system certification. This is what Operation Breakthrough did for 25 of the most innovative US companies. So it allowed them to say, look, we're not going to change this whole regulatory system tomorrow. Let's help those innovative companies make up for all that investment up front in intelligence, in people, and in equipment by saying, you know what, these buildings, as variable as they're going to be, are not being redesigned from scratch. And they're too complex for any local inspector, as well intended as they are, to understand. And there are tools for that. There's tools we're looking at right now as MOD X with partners at ICC and others. There's tools that states can do, but really starting. So let's look at, let's find those innovators and let's help them get through, and help them not just get more units into the system, but help them make their system better through reps. So that's step one. And Japan is the gold standard for that, but they just took Operation Breakthrough and they scaled it to their entire national system, and they're happy to share it. They're happy to share. So that's step one, and that's really, let's say, at a company scale. The step two is really state by state. There's nothing in our federal system that prevents states from deciding to move to a different building code approach overnight. ICC also has a performance code and they're revising it. So looking at which states are willing to go further at a state scale and think about reforms, if nothing else, even with our current building code, ensuring that the state's building code is enforced statewide with little variance is something we could do tomorrow with really no, even federal involvement. And that's something that's doable. And there are states that are further along this process. So one example we like to use is Virginia. Virginia tends to have their kind of state building code and their local building codes pretty much aligned. Their industrialized building code, which is kind of an overlay, is also aligned. That works pretty well. It could be optimized, but it works pretty well. That's very achievable. And then step three is what we recommended through HUD to the federal government, which is to look at the European Union and say, okay, we don't have to have a national preemptive code, which means we would like that. We don't have to force anyone to use a national code if they don't want to. But if we had a performance-based model code and build our whatever federal incentives there are around housing, but also around any other societal goals, align those with the use of that code will get used more. And I can show that is how the European Union has rolled out its performance-based model code across 27 countries, which are very different from each other economically. They don't speak the same language. They have very different climatic, you name it. They had wars more recently than we have had in this country. That system has worked. So there are none of these are innovative. I love to say that. These are really proven techniques. And they all create a regulatory environment that would be familiar to Apple. It would be familiar to the people that produce all our food, the people that produce our pharmaceuticals, and not the way that we have been regulating conventional construction for 150 years.
I mean, I love the approach that you're laying out because it's super common sense. It's not radical. It's patient. It's taking something we've sat on for 70 years and have done nothing about and figuring out a way to actually start moving on it. But let me push against it a little bit because I've heard this analogy that in America, we are effectively building cars in our driveway. You say, like, would you ever build a car in your driveway? It's like, no, that sounds ridiculous. You build it in a factory, right? Well, effectively, that's what we're doing with our housing. And so, pardon my French, but that's fucking stupid. And so you could look at the way America is doing this in the face of a housing crisis that every politician is out there talking about how we need to solve. And in the midst of this crisis, instead of going after something which we've solved, which is an obvious solution point, we're going after things like zoning, which is just a much, much more difficult thing to solve for, in my opinion, than building codes, which I just don't understand. If there's not a clear entrenched interest against it, like, why aren't we fixing this? So let me just maybe ask the question Jeremy asked a little bit differently. Given that we have an administration that is amped up on cutting costs and bureaucracy, that has zero fear about breaking eggs in the process of doing what it's doing to get to an objective that is, less costly, less bureaucratic. If there were a different approach that actually said, we need to build a lot of houses, we need to do it really quickly. And by the way, we are looking stupid in the international scene for the way we build homes today. What radical approach, so take your approach and just say, let's get this done in the next year, so that 3 years from now, 1,000 flowers have bloomed with innovative companies that are changing the way we build. What approach would you recommend if asked to do something more radical?
Well, it's system certification. I think it's the easiest step, which is really, it allows on a kind of company by company scale and on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction scale to say, we have our code. And even if it's just letting a company know that they fulfill those through a product and a quality control system upfront, even if it's a little more onerous, it would create those solutions, and it would create it for a startup, but it would also create it for a larger company. So, Pulte was on our panel at the summit. And, they're a large established home builder. They've invested, and so have many others, in sort of industrialized construction. They now, they brought up this issue that a small startup that, like, let's say Reframe Systems, who was also at the event, and a big builder like Pulte, who's moved, and so have others, Lennar, you name it, they're all looking at this. They're all having the same issues. Once you start buying the equipment and once you start buying the factory space, if you're doing it right, you also start investing in people and knowledge. And now all of a sudden, you're overkilling, because it turns out you're really limited by what's in the code, or showing that you do something similar to it, and by the knowledge of a well-intended inspector who doesn't have time to keep up with all these products. So doing it company by company, this is why Japan started this way. This is why we wanted to start this way. Then you prove it out. Then, a state might say, well, you know what, we're going to open this up to anybody who wants to do it. And that is how it's gone. So the playbook exists. All I've done and all we've done at MOD X is to synthesize it. And it really works. And we know it works because it works. It's not just that we don't build our cars in our driveways. We don't inspect every car that runs off the line. We inspect their quality control system. We inspect their factory. And then if they mess up once, they can't produce cars for years. That's how it works in Japan for housing. That's how it's starting to work in Sweden. There are issues with that too, but it's essentially the only way to industrialize is to also have a regulatory environment that follows industrialization.
So just to make sure I understand what you're saying, Ivan, in terms of the company by company approach, because it's really interesting to me. What you're saying is that a federal government inspector will go in and say, we have inspected every home that Vive is building on or we've inspected the process and the controls that Vive has implemented.
And the engineering. Well, so we already have a system for inspecting factories, but that's not enough. And we have, and again, my good friend David Tompos from ICC NTA is more knowledgeable this. We talk about this with him all the time, but it's more about, to get the flexibility and standardization that you need, you also need the design and engineering package, the product, to be inspected, and a production system. And by the way, all the standards for on-site work, which doesn't often, so all that needs to be inspected. But I can tell you that, a big company like Pulte and a small startup like Reframe, they both have that knowledge. And they'd be happy to go through in detail and then say, look, we've fulfilled this, and now variants of our product should go through the permitting inspection process much faster. And it's not the cost only of permitting inspection, it's the lead time of waiting for that, of negotiating around, instead of focusing on your line, instead of focusing on the product, instead of focusing on creating value for the end user.
But I guess where I was going is, let's say, take Reframe. Once you do that verification, which sounds painful and awful and bureaucratic, but anyway, let's say you suck it up and just do it. Then can anything that comes off the Reframe line be used anywhere in the country? Or have you just basically done the same thing that we have today, which is like, Reframe has gotten permitted to build this type of unit in Seattle, and therefore that's what they have. It's not scale. It's still the same thing. It's just not scalable. It just had another anyway, help me understand how that solves.
So I can tell you, like, right now, if we did that, at least and let's say you went to a certain county or a certain authority having a jurisdiction, at least that system would be permitted, not project by project. So right now you still, so from the regulatory side, it would still require probably whatever the authority is. Now, that could be in some cases a state, in some cases it might be county or city. It depends on which state you're looking at. You're still not doing it project by project. If we can get away from the project by project, we're already making huge progress. And then, sure, then if we can demonstrate, then a state can say, in the state of X, this system transcends, it is completed. There's ways to do this. There's ways to do this today, but there's also ways to build towards it tomorrow. So we should we have an idea about how to cobble this together already, and it's doable today. In fact, there are companies already thinking about doing it. What we need also, as we're developing these innovations in streamlining, we need quick metrics, and we need local, state, and federal government following, and then essentially expanding and growing at a reasonable rate to where maybe tomorrow it's a county, maybe, in a year or two it's a state, and maybe in some cases you're getting, regional certification. But again, there's plenty of examples in peer countries and even in the US that tell us it works, it maintains life safety, which is very important, and it creates 30 to 50% cost savings. Is that going to be passed on to the customer? That's a question for the market. But it's certainly that's a different discussion. We can talk about the affordability of that too. But it certainly creates more volume and makes construction more affordable.
Yeah, you made a reference earlier to like the other things that policymakers or politicians may want to incorporate into the decision. One of the things we say all the time here is jobs that create houses, because jobs is also a huge talking point. Manufacturing jobs at this moment, and those manufacturing jobs have second and third returns if they're producing something that also is a contributory asset to the economy and drives the economy. So, John, it almost sounds like we just need that governor who says, my state's going to be about this, because we've seen that in other areas. We've seen that in ways that different localities have said, we're going to attract business of this area. I'm thinking of movies in Atlanta as an example, but with housing, you could absolutely have that and then be that measurable use case. Because I was really honing in on the fact that we need to measure the metrics quickly and distribute those outcomes as fast as possible to the market.
Yeah, so that's why starting with doable, scalable solutions, understanding what kind of jobs you can walk into, again, some of these companies, and the people, you can tell right away, people working there are happy, they're salaried employees, they look like they like their job. That's very different from construction sites sometimes. It's very different from even some, offsite factories that really have brought construction under roof, but have not invested in research and development, have not invested in their people. And essentially are kind of also having the same problems with like labor retention. So it's not just that moving into a factory is the solution. It's really working like a high-tech, what actually Congress called high-tech companies. That was like a term in '68. We want high-tech housing companies that invest in R&D, invest in people, invest in innovation. And that innovation isn't just about new cool stuff. It's about having the quality we want at a low rate. That's what it's about. And that works. And we know the playbook. So it's a 1, 2, 3 step. And that is essentially how every country has gone through. It's the playbook we set up. We started it. We sort of backed off. It's time to start it again.
Kind of how I feel about this, Ivan, is like, we've discovered nuclear fusion. We've got a way to solve all of our energy problems. We've discovered it. And nobody's fucking doing it. And so I guess part of the thing is, and I know you spend a lot of your time trying to get the word out, but like Jeremy's point about labor and kind of how you talked about it is like, not only can we simplify and modernize our building systems to allow for greater innovation, but it will also reduce the need to be reliant on low-cost labor, which largely has been provided by immigration, which is, looking to be down. And so labor has always been an issue, and now is going to be even more of an issue. And this some way solves for that, because now you move the labor off the site and into a factory, be it panelized or volumetric or whatever it is. And then you also, by the way, our reliance on lumber and other building materials that are expensive is a function of the fact that we've got to sort of meet these very prescriptive standards. And by thinking of a way to make it more performance-based, you allow for innovation, use different types of materials, potentially much cheaper, that actually could be much safer and more energy efficient. So it's sort of like this one amazing little thing about building codes can create such massive benefit for the US system. at a moment where we need it the most. Like,
But we'll
why the
need it in
hell
the
aren't
budget.
people listening? I mean, what are you doing to kind of get the word out? Like, what can our listeners do? Like, do people get this, that it's this profoundly important?
Well, so you brought up zoning, right? Because, zoning, I think in some ways is an area where people with a kind of social science background understand the implications, people with a finance background. Building code requires that plus just a technical understanding. And that's just a challenge. So I have a background in architecture. My business partners do too, and also in construction. It's taken us years to make this story clear. We've been interested in this for decades as researchers. To be honest, we spent a year trying to explain this to the New York Times. Very smart people. It's on us, not on them. And when the piece that came out around Sweden, Francesca Mari did a great piece about our work researching Sweden. It took us a year to try to make this as clear as possible to a broad public. And so you're getting the benefit of that, by the way, in this discussion. And so it's on us. I mean, and the industry has not been very clear about it. And so it's really just making it, as still clear as possible. And that's why I do these podcasts, by the way, is just to get better at explaining it, because it's complicated. The history is complicated. The precedents are complicated. You're talking about technology and human factor of interpreting that technology. It is complicated, but it's just, we can't solve it with money alone, and we can't solve it by doing anything else alone. We need to reform this. We don't like it, but if we want less regulation, if we want higher quality, lower cost, it is not a money issue. It is a will issue. It's a question, but it's not rocket science. It's not a new thing. It's not nuclear fission. My mother's a nuclear physicist. I can tell you that from anecdotally. So it is regulation. It was painful in every other country that has gone on this road, and now they're happy they did it. Sweden, for example, is now doubling down. They're about to release a even more ambitious, even more industry innovation friendly code. It sounds very American to me. It sounds like something Elon Musk would love. In July of this summer, we're going to try to do a podcast, webinar around it too, which is really, it's state of the art, but it's also 50 years of slow and steady improvement. Now they've gotten to a point where really they're putting all the onus on the industry and saying, look, we're going to be as performance-based as possible so we can get out of your way, so you can do the research and innovation and spend the money on the people, but you're responsible. If something goes wrong, like with Boeing recently, you're going to lose your license. You're not going to, the consequences are dire, but we're going to get out of your way project by project, because we know industry doesn't work that way. We know Volvo in Sweden didn't work that way. We know that H&M, the clothing brand, that wouldn't work that way. So that's been the dialogue, and we need U.S. manufacturing sector to tell the story. We need builders that are doing this to explain, like Pulte was so kind to explain how difficult it is for them to operate in the way. We need startups to talk about this, because companies don't like talking about problems because it makes them sound like they're not all powerful, right? And so sometimes that's another role. I don't blame anyone. It's a complicated issue. We're all kind of anxious about saying, this is crazy, but it's just crazy. And there's no other way to save this much money. Sorry. And even like what you were saying, well, we don't need new materials. Wood is a magical material, by the way. It does all kinds of great things. We have lots of it. Even in this country, it's about how we use it. And so, and there's plenty, we will learn very quickly there's ways to use it innovatively if we have the opportunity for a framework that rewards innovation and rewards new solutions, as opposed to getting in their way.
That's so beautifully said.
I was just going to say the same thing, John. That's what we've been looking for. It's like the exact playbook exists. It actually leverages all the things we know and we trust, right? We're talking about materials, jobs, and localities that want them. And we're talking about doing it in a way that we absolutely can claim as innovation, but honestly is just the way others in other industries and in other countries have already shown us, here's how you do this. And now we just need to do it. So I guess I'll ask this question, from my perspective, Ivan, I always want to talk to founders and industry and entrepreneurs. And one of the things you mentioned, it's really great to see established builders like Pulte and startups like Reframe on the same page, on the same panels, not blocking each other, right? Working together. Is this the type of thing where you're seeing industry has to be able to do this end to end to start? Or are you seeing areas where we could use more companies and innovators coming in, right? So I think of Pulte as end to end because they have it all, so to speak. Where are you seeing others like Reframe or startups coming in? And what's your outlook for that segment of the industry?
Well, to be honest, it's interesting that Pulte and Reframe, while one is large and one is small, they're both essentially doing turnkey work. And that integration, at least at first, it's kind of unescapable. We can move from vertical integration to horizontal integration once we get our system fixed. And that is the path. In Japan, the supply chain now supports these companies and they can disintegrate and become more specialized. Unfortunately, it does require this painful process where you need to bring more in-house before you can disaggregate because of this knowledge barrier and because of the control. But also, one thing that we've learned through talking to people about this approach, who loves this approach? The insurance companies. Another topic, right? You can't insure. So, predictability. Oh, accountability. Oh, transparency. Gosh, we love that, and so do banks, by the way, right? I mean, the Japanese banks love prefab companies in Japan. They see them as a night and day difference from construction companies. Not that one is bad and one is good; they do different kinds of business, and so house builder in Japan has a different risk profile than a construction company. They're just one produces products, still provides a service that's unpredictable. So again, like there's, I think, so the vertical integration is important at different scales. It's also what makes companies risky, especially small startups, but that's why we need to help them. This is also, by the way, once you grow up and become a regulatory framework that other sectors recognize, you will see again investment from, like we had in the 70s. GE came into housing during the 70s because there was an idea that we're going to have an adult regulatory environment for housing. Boeing came into housing. Oh, this sounds like the way we produce planes. In Japan, Toyota, Mitsubishi, all the big players came in Sweden. Skanska, which is a construction company, a different business model, came into housing, as did IKEA, because they're like, oh, this sounds like the way we work in building. Even building products are regulated this way, but not building.
It's amazing. Let me make one last, I guess, comment, and Ivan, you're welcome to react to it, because the approach that you have of solving this problem is very grassroots. It starts with companies. It starts by proving out the point, and I think that's a very mature, thoughtful way of doing it, and honestly, probably the most practical. However, I worry that the pace of change in this country is such that I'll retire and nothing will have really changed. And what I'd rather do is retire into a really cool, innovative home that was built under a nationalized performance-based code. That's my dream. And approaches that I've heard discussed, HUD code, as you say, usurps all local code. So if in some ways you could put every industrialized construction project under the HUD code and improve one national code, you somehow usurp everything. And that seems to be the approach that Senator Scott has in his legislation, really sort of removing some of the requirements to meet manufactured housing, which hopefully expands the net by what gets captured by that. The other approach, one that I personally like, is that if I build something in Pennsylvania and Maryland tells me that I can't sell it there, there's a responsibility for Maryland to explain why it can't be sold there. Otherwise, it's a clear violation of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. And one might say that by preventing a home wall panel manufactured in Pennsylvania not being able to be used in Maryland is a violation of the Commerce Clause, unless Maryland can prove climate, that somehow fires are different in Maryland, whatever. The burden of proof is now in Maryland to support their code. And the Commerce Clause, and you could get Pam Bondi out there suing every state and locality for having a building code that's not allowing a manufacturer in the state over it. So that's another way of sort of enforcing. And then everybody has to look to a singular code. And you can say, well, here's a national performance-based code. If you want to sort of meet the Commerce Clause of the Constitution and sort of accept or deny things crossing state lines, then you have to look to this code, and that's the easiest way to do it. So those are the two kind of really crazy sort of top-down ways that you could just, in some ways, almost overnight, federalize and implement a performance-based code. Again, crazy approaches. Then the last thing I'll say with that, and we mentioned this on an earlier episode, is that the improvements that artificial intelligence has made, and this came up earlier, it's really amazing. And I have spent some time with each of the tools, Grok, Claude, asking it to tell me why differences in building codes don't make sense based on weather patterns. And it, in milliseconds comes back with an incredible cost estimate. It's, as you know, AI is just, it's profound. It's really something else. So again, we can kind of leave it as a comment. You're welcome to respond to it. Is we're sort of at this really interesting intersection with this administration, with the technology we have today, with the crisis we have today, and an opportunity to really go top down heavy and make a radical change to American construction. So anyway, whether or not it's practical, I don't know, but I just sort of would like to retire in a better home.
Both of the observations of a national industrialized code and the ability to enforce, interstate commerce clause. I'm nothing against that. It's just I'd like to grow our industry and prove these things out in a more organic way, and then we'll know the pain points. Right now, you're guessing, and you're guessing. I'm guessing. I'm not guessing about the fact that Pulte and Reframe are ready tomorrow to provide a very sophisticated product that we can create a regulatory bubble around, and that can pierce through this and then demonstrate. And then you're going to get all the things you want, Jeremy. You're going to get a national code, or you're going to get, believe me, I think that should be a long-term goal. I'm just always worried that we don't know enough. These are complicated issues. The knowledge within these companies, the knowledge in the field, knowledge in our states and in our towns and our cities is just greater. I'm an empiricist by nature. I'm a researcher by nature. And I just want to know. I don't want to guess. I don't like guessing because, that's where we get into some of these situations too. And so I think by building it up, and we can do it pretty quickly. I mean, Operation Breakthrough had 25 companies pre-certified within a year, and they built the HUD code is essentially based on the code they developed as a tandem code. So it took a year, and that was without AI. And so Japan has, I don't know how many, there's 12 large companies with thousands of certifications, each of which has 60,000 pre-approved screws in it that are all being updated on a 3-month cycle every day for the last 50 years. They use AI now, but they weren't using it in the 80s. I can tell you that. So I think there's ways to do it. I would like to build up. I think that's the way to do it. I think and then we can find, because then you can pinpoint those issues. You can pinpoint where the barriers are, and we don't have to invent a boogeyman. I think mostly it's a lack of knowledge. I don't think anyone is conspiring against more housing. I think there's a lack of knowledge and a lack of knowing about all the nice things we can have, and we can get our cake and eat it too. We can have higher performance buildings and more affordable buildings. In Japan, they didn't pick between seismic and net zero and aging in place and affordability. They got them all. Through doing this.
I love it. I just always want to have somebody I can point to and say, this is who needs to do this, and this is exactly how they do it. And that's kind of what I'm really thinking about now with your approach, Ivan, is who do we take this to and say, look, this is what you have to do. And if you do this, you will literally transform this country in the course of a few years. That to me would be inspiring and compelling. And it's just, I don't know who to say that to. Do you?
Well, we should tell it to everybody. I think we should inform everyone. Knowledge is power. And then I can tell you that there are very smart people in both sides, the regulatory side and the company side, that we're talking to right now. And they're all interested in this, and they didn't know the word performance 2 or 3 years ago. And now, you hear it on every corner, and we're really happy about that because it works. It creates, all the things we want in a more affordable way. So let's just do it.
Amazing. Ivan, I have to say, we've had some amazing conversations on this podcast. So no offense to anyone we've talked to in the past, but it's just, I'm kind of geeky and I'm really, really into this issue, and everything that you said was inspiring and insightful. So thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you both. That was great.
All right, that does it for this episode. We'd love to hear from you guys, the listeners. Send us an email at podcast@thehousinginsiders.com. And please, like Jeremy said before, if you like what you hear, please just leave a review about what you heard.
Hit subscribe for those episodes in your feed. Share comments with us. Tell us who you want as a guest. Thank you, Keenan Chen, for the music.